Liberty. I got back there just before Christmas, and after having spent Christmas there at Liberty, I then decided, well, I better go to work at North American, which I did. I went to work at North American in Kansas City in January 1942. Went to work in final assembly, and they had rolled out about 3 B-25s prior to the time I got there. I went to work as a lead man there because of the experience I'd had in San Diego. But again, you have to realize that I was just a kid, but the men I was being asked to supervise were old enough to be my father, some of them old enough to be my grandfather, that had never worked in an aircraft plant at all, and I had to supervise them. Well, this ended up being a total disaster. These men could not respect me. It was difficult for me to get them to do anything properly. They didn't know how many threads were a minimum or a maximum on an elastic stop nut. I knew what it had to be, but I couldn't get them to do it right. So I ended up going around reworking this stuff. Well, it worked okay, reworking their bad jobs until such time as they employed too many men under me, and I couldn't work fast enough to redo all this stuff. So finally they realized that and came to me one day and said, "Tell you what we're going to do, you're just too young to be a lead man, but we'll turn you into an inspector." So I went to work as an inspector in final assembly, and all I had to do was write up these complaints and big red pencil and draw circles around these problem areas. That's what I ended doing when Jimmy Doolittle bombed Tokyo. I was there in inspection, and along about the same time we lost our first B-25 on a test flight out of Kansas City when it went into the railroad yards. I had read of it in the paper and heard of it on the radio, and when I got into work that morning, they took all the inspectors in this room, and there must have been, I would guess, maybe 150 inspectors that they had all assembled in this room, and they had a stack of black and white photographs, 8x10s, that they started to pass around. The first ones they passed around for all of us to look at were these young men as boys, these young men turning into men, these young men, their wives, these young men, their children. Started to pass these pictures around, and the next thing you knew, they started to show the crash pictures. They first showed the aircraft, then they showed burned bodies, pieces of burned bodies, and we had to sit there and look at all these 8x10 glossies of these men that had needlessly lost their life due to the negligence of someone on the assembly line. Apparently an aileron came loose just after they'd taken off, and the plane went into a spiral into the ground. I left there in about May because, again, I'd heard that things were very, very opportune for going to work for Pan American Airways in their Africa operations. And I wrote a letter to Pan American, got a nice response, and they said, yes, we'd be most interested in talking to you there. We can't assure you employment until you have a release from your employer. So I went to the chief inspector and showed him a letter and said I'd really like this opportunity. I would be going into Africa, to Accra, West Africa, and Pan American was setting up bases there to ferry our planes on into the combat zone and outfit them for combat. Well, by the time I got processed, got out of North American, got the letter back to Pan American, said, "We're sorry, we've filled all of our Africa operation. We no longer need you." So there I was without a job. I didn't want to go back. I could have gone back. They would have taken me back, I know, but I was too proud to go back and say it had all fallen through. So it was then that I was up in the boys' dorm one night talking to some of the college boys and decided, well, I better go back to school that summer. This was the summer of '42. So they said, well, what are you going to do? Well, I didn't know what I was going to do. And Jim Payne had just graduated, several years my senior. Not many years, because part of my time had been spent in North America and consolidated while he was going to school. But at any rate, he was a little bit older than I. And he said, well, he thought he'd go over in Kansas City and check out Navy, flying for the Navy or Army Air Force. He couldn't figure out which was best, but he might be able to do either of them, and either of them would be all right. Why don't you come along with me, Boone? I said, well, you know, what am I supposed to do? He said, well, just come along, we'll go to a movie or something later. So, okay. So, first place we went to the Navy. So, Jim talked to him, told him he just graduated from William Jewell, had his degree, and then he said, well, very interesting. He said, would you fill out this application? So they shoved this application across. They looked at me, and they said, do you want to, I said, I haven't gone to college yet. I said, I'm not a college graduate, much less haven't finished, you know, even started. And he said, well, it's been changed. You don't have to go to college anymore. So I said, you don't? No, just fill out this application. And if you can pass the written test, then we'll give you a physical. If you pass that, then you just, it's a matter of being sworn in. So I thought, oh well, I don't have anything to lose. So I had to wait for Jim anyway. So I filled out this application. Next thing I knew, I was in a room taking a test, finished the test, and next thing you know, we both passed the test. And I thought, my gosh. So I passed the test, and my physical, I didn't get any word on my physical for several weeks. And they were waiting for a waiver, and they never said what the waiver was about. I was to find out later, but I didn't know at that time. So at any rate, finally I get word that I'm accepted as a Navy cadet, and I'd start the flight through the V5 program, which was the Naval Aviation Cadet Naval Reserve program, and it would be later that year or early '43. So I thought, what do I do now? No job, but I've enlisted in the Navy. So then I decided, well, I might as well go to college again. So I enrolled in summer school. That lasted about 1 week, if you can believe, about 1 week. And I was at fraternity house, and a telegram came from one of the buddies there, and I called him up at home. He lived maybe 50 miles away, and said, you know, you have a telegram here. And he said, well, open it up. So I opened it up, and it was a job offer from a mountain resort in Colorado. And he said, well, gee, I've got a job. He said, maybe you might be interested, or someone might. He said, why don't you send him a telegram? So I sent him a telegram and told him that I was an experienced waiter, and I'd be happy to be considered, but that the applicant they had written a letter to had already had employment, and perhaps they could consider my application. So I very quickly got a return Western Union from Troutdale and the Pines.